He was broken, cold, covered in snow, just a forgotten old rescue dog curled up beside a baby, left alone in the middle of a frozen field. The crash had taken everything. No voices, no footsteps, only the wind and the soft sound of a child breathing. But Echo, a dog once trained to save lives, heard something deeper. If you've ever believed that even one soul, 2 legs or 4, can make the difference between life and death, then stand with Echo. Comment, "I believe," to honor his courage. And stay with us as we unfold a story of loyalty, loss, and the quiet power of love in its purest form. The blizzard came without warning, descending upon the Montana mountains like a curtain of white rage. What had been a gentle snowfall by mid-afternoon turned fierce by dusk, blanketing the pine-lined roads and winding cliffs in a suffocating silence. The Callahan family, bound for their cabin retreat after a long week of work and school, never made it to their destination. James Callahan, 38, sat behind the wheel of the family's navy blue pickup truck, eyes narrowed as he fought to see the road through the blinding flurries. Tall and broad-shouldered, with hands shaped by a life of carpentry, James was the kind of man who rarely raised his voice and always kept his promises. In the passenger seat sat his wife, Caroline, 36, with copper hair tucked beneath a knitted cap and hazel eyes made soft by years of loving motherhood. She was slender, elegant in a quiet way, and carried a warmth in her voice that could calm even the most restless of hearts. She had once dreamed of being a poet, but chose instead to raise her family with undivided devotion. Behind them, their son Evan, 9, shy and whip-smart, clutched his sketchbook in one hand and pointed excitedly out the window at snow-covered deer tracks. Strapped beside him in a rear-facing seat was Iris, just 3 years old, cheeks rosy, thumb in her mouth, dozing lightly with a threadbare rabbit plush in her lap. As the truck crested a narrow bend, a sudden gust of wind carved a patch of black ice into the road. The tires lost grip. The truck spun once, then again, before crashing through the rusted guardrail and plummeting down the snow-laced slope. Steel screamed as it collided with jagged rock and ancient tree trunks. When the truck finally came to rest, twisted upside down in a ravine shrouded in pine and smoke, the silence was almost holy. James and Caroline died on impact. Evan's body lay crumpled beneath a shattered window, his sketchbook still clutched in a small frozen hand. Only Iris survived. Her car seat had come loose during the fall and had been flung several feet from the vehicle. She lay still in the snow, her breath shallow, lips tinged with blue, as a fine layer of snow began to settle over her small frame like a shroud. High above, beneath a grove of blackened fir trees, a pair of amber eyes opened. The scent of fire, oil, and blood curled into the cold air, sharp and sudden. Echo, a German shepherd of striking build and presence, lifted his head. His coat, once a brilliant mix of sable and cream, was now dulled by dirt and ash, tangled in burrs and the remnants of his time in the wild. His ears, sharp and alert, twitched toward the sound of metal groaning far below. Echo had once worn a vest marked K9 Rescue, the pride of Glacier County's elite mountain search unit. For 3 years, he had served with unmatched precision, finding lost hikers and avalanche victims, responding to the faintest of scents buried beneath meters of snow. But everything changed after the Langdon boy. A blizzard had closed in quicker than forecast, trapping the child and his father in a remote gorge. Echo and his handler searched through the night, but the child was found too late. The father survived. The boy didn't. The handler, shattered by guilt, left the force. Echo, confused and restless, was transferred to a foster unit. One night, during a thunderstorm, he fled. No one came looking. Since then, Echo had survived as a shadow in the woods, hunting small game, drinking from thawed streams, and learning to avoid hunters and men. The scar above his left brow was a gift from a territorial cougar. His hind leg carried a limp from a bear trap he had once chewed himself free of. He trusted no one. But tonight, something ancient stirred in him. The scent of gasoline, the faint trace of blood, and something else. Something warm and human. Echo moved quickly, a blur of muscle and memory, weaving through snow and stone until he reached the edge of the ravine. He spotted the wreckage immediately. Flames flickered beneath the truck's hood. Steam hissed through the snow. The bodies inside didn't move. He paced cautiously, scanning the scene, and then he heard it. A whimper, faint, fragile, alive. Following the sound, he reached the small shape in the snow. She was bundled in a lavender snowsuit. A plush rabbit clutched to her chest. Her eyes fluttered beneath frostbit lashes. Echo sniffed cautiously, ears back, body low. He pressed his nose to her cheek, still warm, barely. Without hesitation, he began pawing away snow around her, clearing a space, instinct overriding wildness. His training flickered back like sparks in dying embers. He nudged her shoulder, checked her breath. She stirred weakly. It was enough. He took the fleece collar of her coat in his jaws and pulled gently. Inch by inch, he dragged her through the snow, away from the wreckage that might yet explode. Back in town, Naomi Park, 42, stood in her veterinary clinic staring at the emergency radio scanner. The dispatch had come through moments earlier. A vehicle had gone off the ridge near Route 89. Naomi was a woman with tired eyes and steady hands, her once flaming auburn hair now flecked with silver. She moved like someone used to grief. Quiet, efficient, kind. Years ago, she had lost her only child, Kyle, in a house fire while working a double shift at the animal hospital. Since then, she had never been far from her emergency kit. Saving animals was the only way she knew how to survive the ache. She gathered blankets, saline packs, bandages, and emergency feed. If there was an injured animal up there, wild or domestic, she would be ready. Because sometimes, the voiceless ones were the only survivors. Meanwhile, Echo pressed on through the snow, pulling Iris toward the trees, away from the rising smoke. The child's breathing grew slower, but still present. He didn't know where he was taking her, only that she needed to be warm, safe, alive. His instincts, shaped by both man and mountain, told him to act. He had failed once. He would not fail again. And in that moment, Echo, the dog the world had given up on, chose to believe in life once more. The fire began as a hiss, a soft crackle beneath the hood of the overturned truck, but in minutes it grew into a roar that licked hungrily through the twisted metal. Echo's ears twitched at the sound. He didn't flinch. His body moved faster now, knowing time was running out. He clenched Iris's coat tighter between his teeth, careful not to bite too hard, and pulled. Her small boots left dragging impressions in the snow, marking a trail that would soon be covered in soot and ash. Behind them, the wreck groaned and spat fire. A small explosion sent a fender hurtling into the trees, startling a pair of hidden crows. Echo did not turn back. He pulled Iris beyond the reach of the flames, into the arms of the forest, until the orange light no longer cast shadows over the snow. Iris whimpered once, her breath shallow and raspy. Her fingers had loosened their hold on the rabbit plush. Echo paused just long enough to nose it back into her arms before continuing. His instincts screamed for shelter. She would not survive long in the open. Miles away, in the quiet town of Bearfield, a voice crackled through an old ham radio. All units, vehicle off Route 89, possible fatalities, snow still falling, search and rescue mobilizing. In a small cabin at the edge of town, Wyatt Monroe, 52, sat alone at a wooden table, staring at the cold dregs of coffee in a chipped ceramic mug. A tall, weather-worn man, with a square jaw and graying hair pulled into a loose ponytail, Wyatt had once been a respected police officer, known for his calm judgment and loyalty to the force. But everything changed when his daughter, Mia, died in a hit-and-run 5 winters ago. The case was never solved. His marriage collapsed. His badge found its way into a drawer that had remained locked ever since. He lived alone now, in the foothills, surviving off pensions, odd jobs, and the occasional rescue volunteer call. He rarely answered those anymore. But tonight, the static of the radio and the tone of urgency pulled something deep inside him awake. He stood slowly, joints aching, and turned up the volume. The dispatcher repeated the location, North Ridge, near Bear Claw Pass, an old logging road, treacherous even in clear weather. Wyatt's fingers curled. That road led straight through the canyon where he used to hike with Mia. He grabbed his coat. In the rescue station near the edge of town, Naomi Park sat at a metal desk, eyes glued to a screen showing a developing weather map. The storm wasn't over. The heaviest snowfall was expected to resume within the next 2 hours. The emergency team was mobilizing, paramedics, rangers, volunteers, but they were short-staffed. She offered to go with them. They declined. "Too risky," said one of the rangers, a young man named Leo with shaggy blonde hair and frost-nipped cheeks. "We'll call if we find any injured animals." Naomi nodded, biting her tongue. She had spent over a decade on emergency animal rescue calls. Her hands had stitched up bears and bottle-fed orphaned fox kits. She wasn't new to snow, but she didn't argue. She simply packed an emergency duffel, antibiotics, bandages, thermal wraps, and placed it by the door, just in case. Meanwhile, in the forest, Echo slowed his pace. The snow was thickening, his nose stung with the scent of ash. His lungs burned from exertion. But he had found a slight slope under a large rock outcrop, an indentation half covered by snow and pine boughs. It would do. He began to dig with his front paws, clearing space just large enough to place Iris. Then he lay beside her, curling his warm body around hers, tail curved over her legs, chin resting on the snow. His breath steamed in the air. The girl shivered once, then stilled, drawn into his warmth. He stayed awake, listening. An hour passed. Then came the first sound, distant voices muffled by snow, footsteps, men shouting over wind. Wyatt and the search team had arrived. Wyatt stood near the edge of the wreckage, his breath visible in the cold air. His eyes scanned the wreck. The truck was still smoldering, the snow around it tinged gray. "How many?" he asked sharply. "4," Leo replied, "but we only found 3 bodies inside." Wyatt turned to him. "A child?" "Baby seat's missing. We're checking the slope." Wyatt crouched, brushing his gloved hand over the snow. "Any tracks?" "Odd ones, drag marks, like something pulled weight uphill. And these." Leo pointed to a series of paw prints, large, deep, deliberate. "Dog tracks. Big one. German shepherd, maybe." Wyatt's breath caught. "That's no wild dog." He followed the trail, slow and methodical, despite the snow already beginning to erase the prints. He'd tracked fugitives in these woods before. This wasn't a predator's movement. This was careful, intentional. He didn't know yet that Echo had been trained to do just that. Back in her clinic, Naomi opened a notebook. It was filled with drawings, sketches of every animal she had treated over the last 5 years. Her late son Kyle had once told her, "Animals are like angels, Mom. They don't talk, but they listen." She flipped to the last page, a blank one, and began to draw. She didn't know yet that she would soon meet the dog that would change everything. The snow thickened. Trees swayed under the wind. But deep beneath a crag of stone, Echo didn't sleep. His eyes remained fixed outward, ears twitching. And when Iris let out a soft, rasping cry in her sleep, he nudged her closer, resting his chin across her chest like a sentinel who had nothing left to lose. The world had given up on him, but he hadn't given up on her. The cave was barely more than a crevice carved into the hillside, narrow at first glance, but inside it widened into a shallow den, shielded from the wind by layers of frozen pine and compacted snow. Echo had discovered it during his second winter in the wild, after a week-long blizzard had nearly buried him alive in an open gully. Since then, it had become his refuge, a place where memories couldn't find him, where hunger could be survived, where the wind couldn't speak. Tonight, he returned not as a lone survivor, but as a guardian. Iris lay still in the hollow Echo had scratched free of snow. Her face was paler now, her lips nearly gray. Her eyelashes sparkled with frost, and one of her boots was missing. Echo lay curled around her, his thick body forming a cocoon against the cold. He licked the dried blood at her temple with careful strokes, removing the crusted flakes with the gentleness of a nurse. When her limbs spasmed slightly from the cold, he shifted closer, pressing the length of his body against hers, as if his own heartbeat could will warmth back into her bones. Outside, the storm howled through the trees, but in the cave there was only breath, the faint, uneven rise and fall of a child's chest, and the silent vigil of a dog who no longer believed he belonged to the world, yet refused to leave it behind. Across the ridge, beneath a sky now barely visible through wind and flurries, Wyatt Monroe pushed deeper into the forest. The snow came down harder now, stinging his face, clinging to his beard and the thick collar of his canvas coat. He moved like a man with something to prove, but also something to atone for. He carried a flashlight in one hand, a handheld radio clipped to his chest. The rest of the search party had turned back nearly an hour ago, retreating to base camp for the night. The risk of avalanche was growing, visibility near zero, but Wyatt kept going. With each step, his boots sank into snow up to his calves. His breath came ragged. His thoughts drifted to his daughter, Mia, 15, sharp-witted, too fearless for her own good. She had died 5 years ago on a rainy night, not unlike this one, hit by a speeding pickup outside a friend's house. The driver never stopped. Wyatt quit the force 6 weeks later. Couldn't look at a single crash report again. Couldn't see another white sheet zipped over a body without seeing her face. Now, tracking paw prints and the delicate indentations of dragging, something small, child-sized, he felt something different. Not grief, not rage, purpose. Like someone had handed him a thread and told him to follow it, even if he didn't know where it led. Back in town, Naomi Park stood at the ready. Though denied a place on the active search team, she remained in the station's makeshift coordination center. She monitored weather updates, combed through wilderness maps, and had already highlighted possible natural shelters on the terrain grids. A few minutes earlier, she'd sent a quiet, handwritten note to the command lead. Possibility of trained animal intervention. Do not rule out canine rescue scenario. The ranger who received it chuckled and left it on the corner of a desk. But Naomi didn't care. She had once worked with therapy dogs in burn units and search dogs during fire seasons in California. She'd seen what animals could do, how they could sense pain, comfort children too traumatized to speak, find life under rubble when no man could. If there was a dog out there, she wanted them ready. Back in the forest, Echo shifted his position. Iris whimpered in her sleep, a sound somewhere between dream and discomfort. Her body trembled involuntarily. He remembered this from the rescue training days, stage 2 hypothermia. He could do little but stay close and keep her warm. He tucked her closer, resting his snout over her side like a heavy blanket. Above the cave, the trees groaned under the weight of snow. Wind whistled through their branches in tones that sounded eerily human. But Echo did not move. He knew this song. The forest always sang before it tested your will. In his mind, fractured memories flickered. His old handler, Mark, a lean man with a quick laugh and calloused hands, a mountain pass, a buried boy, the sound of his handler's voice breaking for the first time. "We were too late, Echo. We were too late." But not this time. A branch cracked outside the cave. Echo's ears perked. He rose without a sound, eyes narrowing toward the entrance. Snow fell in clumps from the rocks above, obscuring the entrance for a moment. His muscles tensed. Then silence again. Not a predator, just the storm shifting. He lay back down, his breathing slower now, conserving energy. His side ached. He hadn't noticed the shallow scrape along his rib from pulling the child through the woods. It stung, but he ignored it. Far off, Wyatt stopped suddenly. He had found it. A drag trail led to the mouth of a hidden cave, nearly invisible from the ridge. There were prints, dog prints, huge. A domestic breed. He could tell from the way the weight was distributed. Wild dogs didn't move like that. He crouched, radio crackling in his ear. "This is Monroe, North Ridge. I've found something. Tracks. And maybe shelter." No response. Just static. He stared into the darkness of the cave, but didn't enter. Inside, Echo stiffened. He heard the crunch of boots above the ridge, a scent on the wind. Familiar. Not the same as before. Not threatening. Something steady. Male. Older. Echo's body remained tense, but not hostile. He didn't bark, didn't move. Not yet. He needed to be sure. Iris stirred again. Her eyes fluttered open, just slightly. One hand reached out and clutched at the fur beside her. Not her rabbit. Something warm. Alive. She sighed, and drifted back into the safety of unconsciousness. In that moment, Echo decided. He would stay awake, all night if he had to, through the wind, through the cold, through the memories that howled louder than any storm. He would not fail again. By dawn, the wind had softened its fury, but the cold had grown sharper, biting and relentless. Inside the cave, a quiet desperation brewed. Echo lay with his chin resting on Iris's chest, his breath warming her collar. But it was no longer enough. Her body had turned limp sometime in the darkest hour of night. Her skin, already pale, now shimmered with sweat that turned quickly to ice. Her breaths came fast and shallow, and her cheeks flushed with a red that didn't belong to health. She was burning up. Fever. Echo didn't know the word, but he knew the signs. He had seen it before. Once, during a training rescue, a woman trapped in a snow-covered sedan. Her body had been hot to the touch, her breath like steam. His handler had moved quickly then, reaching into the emergency kit. And there had been a scent, strong, earthy, with a bitter edge. Mint. Peppermint leaves. Echo stood, his limbs stiff, muscles sore, but his mind clear. The peppermint had been used to ease fever. His handler used to keep a bundle of dried leaves in the utility pouch. Once, when training in the woods, the scent had come from a patch of wild mint beneath a fallen log. The smell had stuck with him. He nudged Iris gently, as if to reassure her that he would return, then turned and padded from the cave. Snow crunched beneath his paws. The wind nipped at the long guard hairs of his coat, but he did not hesitate. The forest beyond the ridge was thick with fir and spruce. Echo moved like a shadow between trees, following instinct and the memory of a scent long lost to time. He paused at a ridge where the wind curled down into a gulch, sniffed, and changed course. His paws brushed over crusted roots, his nose to the snow. Finally, under a jagged rock outcropping near the base of an ancient cedar, he found it. A patch of mint, half covered in snow, hardy and green despite the frost. He pawed at the ground, careful not to crush the fragile leaves. Then, using the gentlest part of his mouth, he plucked several stems and began the slow climb back. Back in town, Naomi Park sat in the corner of the rescue station break room, her stethoscope draped around her neck like a necklace of unspoken prayers. A mug of untouched tea steamed on the table beside her. A younger vet tech named Carla had just asked a question that sent Naomi drifting into a memory. "Have you ever had to treat an animal in a storm like this?" Naomi's eyes lost focus for a moment. Then she answered, voice low, measured. "There was a dog," she began, "about 10 years ago, pulled from a house fire during a snowstorm, not unlike this one. They said it was a stray, but it had the eyes of someone who'd once been loved. His body was burned down one side. He was in shock. They brought him to me in a cardboard box, thinking he wouldn't last the night." Carla leaned in, quiet. "I didn't have the heart to give up. I spent hours beside him, breathing warmth into his lungs, stitching while my hands shook. And when he opened his eyes, just once, and licked my wrist, I knew I had to stay with him until the end, or the miracle." "Did he make it?" Carla asked. Naomi smiled faintly. "He did. Walked again in 3 weeks. I named him Flint." Outside, the storm threatened to rise again. Inside, Naomi placed a hand over the duffel she kept ready. Supplies, IV kits, syringes. She couldn't shake the feeling that tonight, again, something was waiting to be saved. Meanwhile, Wyatt Monroe moved carefully across the high ridge, scanning the snow-covered ground with the eyes of a man who had seen too many accident scenes. He was alone now, radio static filling his ear. The others called back to the base to regroup. But he refused to stop. Something deeper than duty pulled him forward. His flashlight swept across the snow. Nothing. Again. Then, something caught in the low brush. A color out of place against the white. Red. Wyatt crouched, brushed away the snow. A child's sweater. Pale blue wool with a stitched red heart on the sleeve, torn at one side. He held it up gently, snowflakes clinging to the threads. She was out here, alive. The tracks were nearly gone, covered by fresh snowfall, but not entirely. He turned toward the forest with new determination. Inside the cave, Iris trembled violently in her sleep. Her cheeks were flushed, lips dry. Her fever was rising. Then, a rustling sound. Echo returned, shaking snow from his back like a wolf shedding a nightmare. He approached the girl and placed the mint leaves beside her head, arranging them with his snout. Then he lay down beside her again, his body forming a wall of warmth. The scent filled the cave, sharp, clean, familiar. It was not medicine in the human sense, but it was what he had. He nudged one of the leaves closer to her nose. She stirred. Outside, Wyatt paused again. Something broke the hush of the snow. A sound. Faint, distant, a bark. Short, hoarse, raw and real. Echo's voice, after nearly a year of silence, rose into the sky. Not loud, not fierce, just one bark, cut from the very core of his being. Wyatt froze. Another bark came, then silence. He turned toward the direction of the sound and began to run. The forest, though blanketed in white, held its own kind of danger that night. Beyond the howling wind and cracking trees, something older stirred. A predator driven not by cruelty, but by hunger. The scent of blood was faint but unmistakable, carried by the wind like a whispered promise. The gray wolf had wandered for miles through the storm, its ribs sharp beneath matted fur, one eye clouded with age, the other gleaming with wild intelligence. It was no longer part of a pack. It hunted alone now, and the scent it followed led to the cave, to warmth, to weakness. Inside, Echo stirred. He had dozed briefly, exhaustion finally pressing against his spine like a stone too heavy to carry. But when the wolf's paw crunched on the snow just outside the cave's mouth, Echo's eyes flew open. He didn't growl. His breath was too shallow. Instead, he pushed himself to his feet, staggering, positioning his body once more between Iris and the cold. Blood still dampened his chest from where he'd scraped himself during the mint search. His back legs shook with strain. The wolf appeared in the entrance like a shadow summoned from the wind, its breath steaming in the cold, its ribs heaving from the climb. Taller than Echo by a few inches, leaner but hungry, it hesitated, sizing up the scent of man and child and dog. It took a step forward. Echo growled low now, the sound trembling but real. He knew this dance. No bared teeth or fluffed fur would matter. Only resolve. Behind him, Iris moaned in her sleep. The wolf lunged. Echo met it mid-air. They collided with a crash, limbs tangled, bodies snapping through snow. Teeth found fur, claws raked hide. Echo bit the wolf's shoulder, pushing with his last strength, forcing it away from the girl. The wolf snapped at his neck, leaving a shallow wound behind Echo's ear. They rolled, slammed into the cave wall, broke apart, then met again. But Echo was tired, too tired. The second lunge caught him off balance. The wolf bit down on Echo's flank, and a yelp split the air, high and pained. Echo responded by twisting his body and driving his shoulder into the wolf's ribs, forcing it back. For a moment, both animals stood locked in place, chests heaving, blood painting the snow beneath them. Then, something echoed from the trees. A voice. Human. Wyatt. He had heard the yelp and the scuffle, and now he ran, the flashlight in his hand bouncing with every stride, his heart hammering as though it might break through his ribs. He hadn't stopped moving since hearing the bark hours earlier, following its fading trail like a thread of fate. His boots hit hard-packed snow. His breath was visible. He ducked low branches, heart in his throat. Another growl, followed by a cry, a child's. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He saw the cave, and then he saw them. The gray wolf turned to face him, eyes gleaming in the beam of his light. Echo stood in front of the girl, swaying now, one leg dragging, one eye swollen shut. His fur was blood-matted. Still, he did not back down. Wyatt did the only thing his body knew. He raised his voice in a roar, primal and loud, throwing a rock from the ground. It struck the wolf on the hind leg. The animal snarled, but did not attack. It locked eyes with Echo one last time, a silent acknowledgement of strength. Then it turned and melted into the woods. Wyatt dropped to his knees. His flashlight beam fell fully on the scene. The child, alive. The dog, barely. Wyatt didn't breathe for a second. He took in the pale cheeks of the girl, the tiny blue sweater with the red heart, the way her fingers curled weakly into Echo's fur. His throat tightened. She looked just like Mia. Not exactly, not truly, but the shape of her face, the eyelashes dusted in frost, the innocence of someone who'd known love and loss too young. Wyatt's knees gave out beneath him. He crawled forward, voice shaking. It's okay, baby girl. I've got you now." Then he saw Echo's eyes. The German Shepherd didn't growl, didn't move. He simply looked at Wyatt, not as an enemy, not even as a stranger, but with an exhausted, ancient expression, one that said, "I've done what I could. Forgive me if I can't do more." Wyatt's chest cracked open in a way he thought no longer possible. He gently placed his hand on Echo's bloodied head. "You did good," he whispered. You did more than anyone." Echo's body trembled once and then slumped. Wyatt panicked, but the dog still breathed. Shallow, slow, alive. He turned to the radio clipped on his vest, his voice urgent. "This is Monroe. I've located the child, alive, and the dog too, both in critical condition. I need a med team, and a vet if we've got one." From town, Static answered at first. Then Naomi's voice broke through. "I'm on my way." The helicopter lifted through the mountain air like a trembling bird fighting gravity. Its blades cut through the misty dawn, thundering above the white-streaked forest as it soared over the vast Montana wilderness. Inside, nestled between paramedics and crates of emergency supplies, lay 2 passengers. Iris, wrapped in a heat blanket, her tiny face flushed but steady, and Echo, silent, motionless, strapped to a gurney beside her. Wyatt Monroe sat between them, one gloved hand gently resting on Iris's shoulder, the other gripping the metal edge of Echo's stretcher. He hadn't let go since the moment they pulled the dog from the snow-covered cave. His heart beat harder every time Echo's chest hesitated, as if the dog were considering whether to return from the brink or let go. Across from him sat Naomi Park, her sleeves rolled up to the elbow, her hands never idle. She had come the moment Wyatt's call came through. The first to reach the landing site, her duffel of vet tools already unzipped before Echo was even lowered onto the snow. Now she worked silently, listening, checking, reading his vitals with the intensity of someone who knew what it meant to lose a second too late. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight bun, her cheeks windburned from the hike. She had operated in worse conditions before, but never with a case so raw, so urgent. "Still breathing," she muttered, adjusting the oxygen flow near Echo's muzzle. "But blood pressure's low. We'll need to open a line the moment we land." Wyatt looked up. "Can he make it?" Naomi didn't lie. "He's got a chance. He's got the will. That's more than most." In the seat next to her sat Dr. Alvin Green, the town's senior vet and Naomi's mentor. A quiet man in his 60s, thin as a rail, with round spectacles and a voice so soft it was nearly swallowed by the hum of the cabin. He glanced at the readings and nodded once. "It'll be tight, but if he survives the first few hours, he might just surprise us." The helicopter touched down at the Bearfield Animal Emergency Clinic, a squat building nestled between a gas station and a frozen creek. The moment the skids hit the ground, Naomi and Green moved like clockwork, sliding Echo's stretcher onto a gurney, wheeling him through the double doors and straight into surgery prep. Wyatt carried Iris into the waiting ambulance nearby, where pediatric EMTs rushed her toward the county hospital. The town buzzed. Within an hour, news of the hero dog spread like fire and dry brush. Social media posts appeared with blurry photos of the helicopter. The local news picked it up next, and then the national networks followed. Words like miracle and guardian angel flooded comment sections. Within 24 hours, Echo had a hashtag trending. But Echo, sedated and barely breathing, knew none of it. Inside the clinic, Naomi worked through the morning with practiced efficiency. She stitched the tear in Echo's shoulder. She flushed the deep puncture wounds left by the wolf. She monitored organ swelling, regulated fluids, ran labs. At times, she paused just to place her hand on his ribcage, feeling for the rise and fall that marked one more minute alive. "You're not done yet," she whispered once when the vitals dropped for the 3rd time. "You've still got work to do." In the lobby, the world gathered. Reporters from out of town arrived, shivering in their city coats. One from a well-known morning show tried to bribe the front desk clerk for an early look at the dog. Another suggested a feature documentary. A camera crew was already assembling footage outside. And then came the email. It arrived on the clinic's inbox, addressed to the owner of the miracle dog, sent from a sleek PR firm representing a national rescue foundation. The subject line read, "Proposal to acquire hero dog for national campaign." The message was polished, professional, and impersonal. They wanted Echo for public appearances, media coverage, a branded product line. A true ambassador for canine courage, they called him. Naomi read it twice, then forwarded it to Wyatt with one sentence. "We can't let them take him." Wyatt arrived at the clinic minutes later. He hadn't slept. Iris was stable at the county hospital, monitored closely in the ICU, but still unconscious. He carried with him a thermal mug of coffee, a manila folder, and something heavier in his eyes. He stood by Echo's recovery crate, staring at the dog who had guarded his own second chance. "I don't care what logo they want to put on his face," he said quietly. "He's not a brand. He's a survivor." Naomi nodded, arms folded. "But legally, without an owner, I'm working on that." He reached into the folder and pulled out a portable scanner, borrowed from a former colleague at Animal Control. He crouched beside Echo's crate and ran the scanner along the base of his neck. A beep, then numbers. Naomi leaned over, squinting at the screen. "It's registered." Wyatt opened his phone, typing fast, cross-referencing the ID through the National Pet Registry. The record appeared. Name, Echo, breed, German Shepherd, age, 6, original role, SIR Search and Rescue, unit, Northern Divide Team, owner, Sergeant Marcus Hall, deceased. Naomi exhaled. He was trained. That's why he knew how to find her. Why he pulled her from the wreckage. Wyatt stared at the name. Echo. "The name suits him," Naomi said. "The echo of everything good he once was, and still is." Wyatt closed the file and looked at the dog, still unconscious, his chest slowly rising under layers of bandages and IV tubes. The world outside could wait. The media could spin. The contracts could burn. Because inside this little clinic, they had found something no news anchor could script. A dog who'd been lost and chose to love again. The nurses said Iris was lucky. The pediatrician called it a miracle. And to some degree, they were right. Her internal injuries had stabilized quickly. Her fever had broken within 48 hours, and her brain scans showed no signs of lasting damage. But luck did not explain the silence. She had not spoken a word since waking up. Not to the nurses, not to the trauma specialist, not even to Wyatt. She simply stared. From her hospital bed, Iris spent hours gazing through the frost-laced window. The sky changed. The trees swayed. Visitors came and went. But Iris waited. Her small fingers clutched the edge of the blanket like an anchor, her eyes fixed on the line where earth met sky. A quiet question lingered in them, not of where she was, but of who was missing. Naomi noticed it first. During one of her daily check-ins, split between Echo's care and occasional updates from the hospital, she leaned over Iris's bed and said softly, "You're looking for someone, aren't you?" Iris blinked once, then, slowly, turned her head away. Naomi didn't press. She knew that kind of silence, the kind that comes after fire, after trauma, when words simply don't feel big enough to hold the weight of grief. At the animal clinic, Echo was still recovering. Though stable, he no longer had the use of his hind legs. The spinal trauma, likely from the wolf's bite or a hidden injury from the accident, had caused partial paralysis. Dr. Green had done all he could. Surgery, anti-inflammatories, supportive therapy. But the prognosis remained grim. Echo might walk again, but chances were slim. Most likely, he'd need wheels, or rest, for life. Wyatt had been the one to carry him outside the first time, carefully, bundled in a blanket, his arms strong but gentle. He'd sat with him under a pine tree behind the clinic, Echo lying across his lap like an old companion. The snow was gone now, replaced with muddy thaw and bits of green peeking through. Spring was early this year. "They think you're done," Wyatt murmured into the fur behind Echo's ear. "But I've seen the way you look when Iris's name comes up. You're not done. You're just beginning." Naomi would often watch them from the window, Wyatt with his unshaven jaw and tired eyes, the hardened ex-cop who refused to speak of his own pain. She knew he had a past. Knew from a whispered nurse report that he had lost a daughter of his own. Mia, age 15, hit and run. No one ever caught the driver. And Naomi suspected that Echo wasn't the only one limping from that mountain. But outside the clinic, the world had its own ideas for the story. The media storm had only grown fiercer. Echo was now the subject of morning talk shows, viral documentaries, tribute illustrations by school children, and even a trending petition demanding justice for Echo, whatever that meant. It was the PR firm that posed the real threat. They'd sent legal paperwork this time. A claim filed through the National Canine Welfare Coalition, arguing that because Echo was found in a wilderness zone with no living registered owner, he was technically unclaimed property. The organization, backed by a powerful media group, intended to assume stewardship for the betterment of canine visibility in rescue narratives. Wyatt nearly tore the letter in half. Instead, he called Naomi. "They're not taking him." Naomi nodded, eyes like steel. "Then we fight." They reached out to the registry again, verifying Echo's previous handler had indeed died during a hiking accident nearly 3 years ago. Echo had gone missing afterward. Officially, he had been presumed dead. "He wasn't dead," Wyatt said, reading over the registry file. "He was grieving. Like her." Together, Wyatt and Naomi contacted a friend of Dr. Green's, a quiet but sharp-witted animal law attorney named Louise Brennan. She was in her late 40s, wore a wool coat in all weather, and had a reputation for handling cases no one else would touch. She arrived at the clinic with a briefcase and zero patience for media. "They want to use this dog's trauma for profit," she said flatly. "I won't allow it. We'll file for emergency foster guardianship, followed by a permanent adoption request, citing psychological ties to the rescued child." Wyatt looked up. "That'll hold?" Louise closed her case with a click. "It'll do more than hold. It'll make them look like fools if they push it." But as the legal defense took shape, Wyatt's attention began to shift. Something about the crash didn't sit right. He'd kept the official report from the volunteer team, reviewed the debris, looked at the tire marks, and something didn't match. There were signs of a second vehicle. Skid patterns, paint transfer, faint, but there, not consistent with a single-car slide. One night, he sat at the kitchen table in his cabin, just outside Bearfield, reviewing the autopsy summary and vehicle assessment. The impact angle on the Callahan family's pickup truck showed a sharp side deviation, too sudden for a natural slide, more like it had been clipped, forced. A hit and run. And whoever did it had disappeared into the storm. Wyatt knew that kind of cowardice. He saw it on the face of the man who had taken Mia and fled. It haunted him every night. But this time, he might be early enough to make it right. He began visiting local mechanics, quiet conversations. He checked hospital logs for emergency visits around the time of the accident. He reviewed traffic cameras, even though the range was poor. Little by little, a shape was forming. The person who hit the Callahans didn't just vanish, they covered their tracks. But the truth always left fingerprints. Back at the hospital, Iris was slowly beginning to move again. She'd stopped staring at the window. Now she looked toward the door. Every afternoon around 4, Wyatt arrived with a paper cup of hot chocolate and a soft brown scarf that smelled like the woods. He would sit beside her and tell stories, not about police work or the war he'd fought inside himself, but about Echo. "He used to be the best," Wyatt told her one day, brushing a strand of hair from her eyes. "People called him the one who found the lost. And I think maybe he was lost too." Iris didn't answer, but that night she spoke for the first time. Just one word. "Echo?" Wyatt smiled through the burn in his eyes. "Yes, baby girl," he whispered. "He's waiting for you." The man's name was Russell Brandt. Middle-aged, stocky, with calloused hands and tired eyes. He worked nights hauling timber across state lines. On the night of the storm, he'd been driving down the Ridge Road. Too fast for the conditions, half a cup of gas station coffee in his veins, and barely enough sleep to keep his eyes open. He didn't see the Callahan family's pickup until it was too late. Wyatt found him living 3 counties east, in a rented trailer behind a mill. It had taken weeks of quiet digging, license plate fragments, an anonymous tip from a mechanic who'd repaired a dented grill, a match on security footage from a hunting store just before the storm. Wyatt didn't knock like a cop. He knocked like a man who had carried too many ghosts and was tired of silence. Brandt opened the door with a cigarette between his fingers and a look in his eyes that said he already knew someone was coming. "You were there," Wyatt said. Brandt didn't deny it. He didn't even blink. "I didn't stop," he said. "Didn't even check if they were breathing." Wyatt didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You'll come with me," he said. Brandt nodded. 2 days later, he walked into the sheriff's office and confessed everything. Justice, delayed, had found its way through the storm. Wyatt stood outside the courthouse that day, hands in his pockets, the wind tugging at the collar of his coat. He thought of Sarah Callahan, her husband, their son. He thought of Iris, who had lost everything but never asked why. He thought of Mia, his own daughter, gone before she had a chance to learn how unfair the world could be. And he thought of Echo, who had bridged the past and future like a miracle carved from snow. At the hospital, Iris had just learned to smile again. The child Wyatt had once found silent and trembling was now full of quiet fire. She laughed in spurts, mostly when Naomi visited. She clutched her cup of cocoa with both hands. She said Echo's name every morning when Wyatt entered the room. When he finally asked her if she'd like to live with him, really, truly live, she hadn't said yes. She had wrapped her arms around his waist and buried her face in his coat, and that had been enough. The day Echo passed, the sky was the color of warm slate. A wind carried the scent of pine and dried leaves. It was the kind of day where you didn't expect sorrow, but it came gently, like everything Echo had done. He was lying on the porch of Wyatt's cabin, resting in a patch of sunlight that spilled across the wood. Iris, now home for nearly a month, was brushing his ears softly, her voice humming something old and forgotten. Echo's body had weakened in the past weeks. His breathing had grown shallow and his eyes slower to open, but his gaze had remained full of knowing. That afternoon, as Iris read aloud from a picture book, Echo leaned his head into her lap, and he stopped breathing. There were no cries, no last sounds, only the hush of peace as he let go, surrounded by the only people who had ever asked nothing of him but to be. Wyatt dug the garden himself, not out of pride, but ritual. It sat on the hill above the cabin, under a crooked cedar tree where Echo had once laid to watch the stars. Naomi helped plant the first row of wildflowers, gentian and lupin, soft purples and blues that caught the morning light. A stone marker stood at the center, carved with care, reading, "Echo, the hero never forgotten." It became their place. On bad days, Wyatt would go and sit in silence. On good days, Iris would bring drawings or small bones she'd found on hikes, placing them at the base of the stone like offerings. Naomi would bring fresh herbs to plant, whispering things only the wind could carry. And then, time passed. The kind of passing that heals not by forgetting, but by transforming. Years later, the room was full of people, students in white coats, professors, reporters with notepads, and in the center, a young woman stood behind a wooden podium, her brown curls tucked behind her ear, her hand resting on the shoulder of a German shepherd in a red rescue vest. Iris Monroe, 22 now, a senior in veterinary science, calm and composed, with her father's steadiness and her own unshakable resolve. Behind her, a banner hung high, Echo Foundation Rescue Training for Cold Regions. The crowd applauded. Iris adjusted the mic and began. "I don't remember the day I was saved," she said. "I don't remember the crash, the cold, or the cave." A pause, her voice softened. "But my heart does." She reached down, placing her palm gently over the shepherd's chest. "It remembers the warmth of a body wrapped around mine, the sound of a heartbeat not too different from my own, the scent of pine and blood and fur." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The world once left him behind. Echo was a dog trained to save people. Then, one day, he failed, and they cast him out. A breeze lifted the edge of her speech. She didn't need the paper anyway. But when I needed saving, he didn't hesitate. He found me, protected me, loved me, without a single word. She smiled now. "I don't think love always needs a voice. Sometimes it needs presence. Sometimes it needs scars. Sometimes it just needs a second chance." Behind her, Naomi stood near the edge of the stage, her arms folded tightly, tears clinging to her lashes. Wyatt was seated in the front row, his beard now salt and pepper, his shoulders proud. When the ceremony ended, the crowd rose as one, and in the front corner of the lobby, beneath a pane of glass, stood a weathered leather collar, a paw print cast in clay, and a single tag that read, "Echo." In the garden outside the facility, where therapy dogs would one day play, a statue stood in the shade of a birch tree. It was carved in white stone, strong, noble, looking out into the horizon. No words were inscribed, because everyone already knew. Sometimes, God sends his angels not in robes or wings, but in fur and silence. Echo was one of them. This story isn't just about survival in a snowstorm. It's about redemption, second chances, and the quiet, miraculous ways love returns to us when we least expect it. When the world had forgotten him, Echo remembered his purpose, and through that purpose, a child lived. In life, we all carry wounds, some visible, others buried deep. But like Echo, We are never truly alone. There are moments when the divine steps into our lives through the kindness of a stranger, the warmth of a friend, or even the loyalty of a dog who refuses to give up. These are not coincidences. They are reminders that God's love echoes through the brokenness. So, today, if you're facing something heavy, if the world feels cold and the path uncertain, remember Iris, remember Echo, and believe that miracles still happen, especially when we choose love again and again. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Comment below. I believe in second chances. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Stories where faith walks on four legs and love leaves paw prints on the soul. And may God bless you wherever you are. May He guide your steps, warm your heart, and send you your own echo when you need Him most. A tiny, helpless puppy was trapped in a storm drain, his cries drowned by the relentless rain. People passed by, too busy to notice, until a homeless boy stopped, his heart aching for the little creature. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't reach him. The water was rising fast. Then, out of the shadows, a mysterious man appeared, someone no one expected to be a hero. What happened next left an entire community in tears. Chapter 1. Cries in the Rain. The rain had been relentless since dawn, pounding the streets of Chicago with icy sheets that blurred the city lights. Thunder rumbled overhead, shaking the air, while rivers of water rushed along the curbs, feeding into the storm drains that lined the cracked sidewalks. Among the deafening noise of the storm, there was a softer sound, one barely noticeable amidst the downpour, a tiny, desperate whimper. The source of that sound was a small puppy, no more than 6 weeks old, its fragile body half submerged in a storm drain. It had short, matted fur the color of caramel, though the rain had darkened it to a deep chestnut. Its eyes, wide, glassy, and terrified, blinked rapidly as water swirled around its tiny paws. The puppy had no collar, no signs of ever belonging to someone, and yet it cried as if pleading for a rescue that seemed impossible. Pedestrians hurried past with umbrellas and raincoats, their faces turned downward, oblivious to the tiny creature's struggle. The streets of Chicago had a rhythm of indifference, where rushing through was easier than stopping. No one noticed, except for Ethan. Ethan was 11 years old, but the harshness of life had aged him in ways no child should endure. He was thin, his frame wrapped in layers of oversized, ragged clothing that barely kept him warm. His dark brown hair was tangled, his face smudged with dirt, and his sneakers, once white, were now soaked and torn. He had been living on the streets for months, ever since his mother had disappeared, leaving him with nothing but the worn-out backpack slung over his shoulder. Most people ignored Ethan, just like they ignored the puppy. He had learned long ago that begging for help only led to cruel stares and murmured judgments. But when he heard the tiny whimper, something in him refused to walk away. Kneeling by the grate, Ethan peered inside, his heart twisting at the sight of the shivering puppy. "Hey, little guy." "Hold on," he murmured, stretching his arm through the bars, but the opening was too narrow, and the puppy flinched, scrambling against the rising water. Panic surged through Ethan's chest. The rain wasn't letting up, and the water level inside the drain was rising fast. If no one helped, the puppy would drown. He looked around, searching for someone, anyone, who might listen. "Please, someone help," he shouted, waving his arms at the passing figures beneath their umbrellas. A businessman in a sleek black coat barely spared him a glance. A woman in heels pulled her child closer, avoiding his gaze. A teenager with headphones walked right past. No one stopped. Ethan clenched his fists, his breath quickening. He was used to being ignored. He had spent too many nights curled up in alleyways, too many days watching people pretend he wasn't there. But this wasn't about him. This was about the tiny life in that drain, a life that was slipping away with every second. He turned back to the grate, ignoring the rain soaking through his clothes. He had to do something. That was when a deep, weathered voice spoke behind him. "What's going on, kid?" Ethan spun around and found himself face to face with Frank. Frank was a man in his late 50s, his once broad shoulders now slumped from years of hardship. His salt and pepper beard was unkempt, his skin rough and tan from years of exposure to the elements. He wore a tattered brown coat over an old flannel shirt, his boots caked with mud. But despite his worn-out appearance, his blue-gray eyes were sharp, observant. Frank had been homeless for over a decade, moving from shelter to shelter, never staying in one place too long. He spoke little about his past, but there was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself. He had learned how to survive when the world had forgotten him, and yet, unlike most, he had not lost his ability to care. "It's a puppy," Ethan said quickly, pointing to the drain. "He's stuck, and the water's getting higher." Frank crouched beside him, peering into the darkness below. The puppy whimpered again, barely keeping its head above the water. Frank exhaled sharply. "Damn storm," he muttered. "All right, kid, we gotta act fast." He pulled a metal hanger from the bag slung over his shoulder, a makeshift tool he often used to fish through dumpsters for scraps. He bent it into a hook, sliding it through the bars, trying to loop it under the puppy's small body. But every time he got close, the water pushed the puppy further out of reach. "Come on, little guy," Frank murmured, his voice steady. "Work with me." Ethan held his breath, his fingers gripping the cold metal bars as Frank tried again. The rain pounded harder, the water inside the drain churning wildly. The puppy yelped, then suddenly slipped, its tiny body plunging deeper into the rushing water. "No!" Ethan screamed, his heart stopping. Frank cursed under his breath. The rain wasn't slowing down. The drain would flood within minutes. Ethan felt helpless, his chest tight with frustration. The same helplessness he had felt when his mother had left. The same helplessness that had followed him every day since. But this time, he refused to let it win. He looked up desperately at Frank, but the old man was already making a decision Ethan never expected. With one swift motion, Frank tossed his coat aside and moved toward the edge of the drain. His hands gripped the wet pavement as he positioned himself, preparing to do something reckless. "What are you doing?" Ethan gasped. Frank shot him a wry, tired smile. "Somebody's got to go in." And with that, he lowered himself into the rushing water. Frank barely had time to register the icy shock of the water before it pulled him under. The current was far stronger than he expected, a churning force that slammed him against the slimy concrete walls of the storm drain. Darkness swallowed him, the only light coming from the distant opening above where Ethan's terrified face hovered. The water stung his eyes, filling his ears with an angry roar. He had been through rough situations before. Freezing nights on the streets, fights over food and shelters, the slow, gnawing pain of hunger. But this was different. This was a fight against something bigger than himself. He kicked hard, trying to orient his body against the rushing current. Somewhere ahead, the tiny whimper of the puppy still echoed, weak and fading. Frank pushed forward, his arms straining against the pull of the water. His old muscles screamed in protest, but he ignored them. He reached out, his fingers brushing against something small and trembling. The puppy. It was barely clinging to the side of the pipe, its tiny claws scratching against the slick metal. "I got you, little guy," Frank rasped, securing his grip around the sodden fur. The puppy's body was limp from exhaustion, but its heart still pounded beneath Frank's fingers. He didn't have time to celebrate. The current surged again, dragging him further down the tunnel. Above ground, Ethan was gripping the edge of the grate so hard his knuckles turned white. His pulse pounded in his ears, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Frank had disappeared beneath the water, and the only proof that he was still alive was the occasional splash below. People were still walking past, ignoring him. He couldn't let this happen. "Somebody help!" Ethan shouted, his voice raw. He had never felt more powerless in his life. Then, finally, someone stopped. Margaret had been locking up her cafe for the evening when she heard the shouting. She was in her late 40s, a woman with warm, olive-toned skin and sharp, dark eyes that missed nothing. Her thick brown hair was streaked with silver, always tied back in a loose bun, and she wore an apron over her coat, a sign that she had barely finished her shift. She wasn't the kind of person who ignored things. Life had made her that way. She had been raised in a rough neighborhood, taught to be tough, to survive, to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. Losing her husband to a car accident 10 years ago had only hardened her resolve. If she saw someone in trouble, she acted. Now, she was staring at the soaking wet boy, his face streaked with rain and panic, pointing desperately at the storm drain. "There's a man down there. He was saving a puppy, but the water, he's stuck. I think he's drowning." Ethan was practically gasping the words out. Margaret's eyes widened, and without hesitation, she pulled her phone from her coat and dialed 911. I need emergency rescue on 4th and Monroe, now. There's a man trapped in a storm drain, and the water's rising fast. She turned back to Ethan, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. What's his name? Frank, Ethan choked out, his body shaking. Margaret's grip tightened. Okay, Frank is going to be okay. Help is coming, but we have to keep him above water until then. Inside the drain, Frank was fighting to stay afloat, the puppy clutched tightly in his arm. His head broke the surface for a split second, just enough for him to see the light above. A voice reached him, Margaret's, calling out. Frank, if you can hear me, hold on, we're getting help. Help. The word barely registered. He didn't have time to wait. He could feel the puppy's tiny chest heaving, the little body too weak to fight anymore. If he didn't act now, it wouldn't make it. Summoning the last of his strength, Frank maneuvered his body against the current, pushing himself upward. His arms were trembling, his breath ragged, but he reached toward the narrow opening above. Ethan saw the movement, and without thinking, he threw himself flat on the wet pavement, reaching down. Frank, give me the puppy! Frank barely managed to stretch his arm upward, his hand slipping against the cold metal of the grate. Ethan lunged, his fingers closing around the scruff of the tiny, soaked creature. He pulled with everything he had, lifting the trembling puppy free of the drain. The moment the weight left his hands, Frank felt the current grab him with renewed force. Frank! Ethan's voice cracked, his arms reaching back down, but it was too late. The water surged violently, dragging Frank backward into the darkness. The last thing he saw before the world went black was Ethan's horrified face disappearing from view. Ethan's hands were shaking as he clutched the tiny, drenched puppy to his chest. Rain still pounded the streets, soaking through his clothes, but he barely felt it. His eyes remained fixed on the storm drain, his voice raw from shouting. Frank! Frank! Beside him, Margaret gripped the edge of the pavement, scanning the swirling water below with a sickening sense of dread. Her heart pounded against her ribs, and for the first time in years, she felt helpless. She had seen hardship, had lived through loss, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of a man being swallowed by the current right in front of her. Ethan turned toward her, his voice cracking. He saved the puppy. He saved him. But now he's... His words broke off into shallow gasps. Margaret placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Listen to me, kid. He's tough. He made it this far. We're going to find him. Ethan swallowed hard and nodded, but his hands didn't stop trembling. The puppy nestled deeper into his arms, its tiny body still shivering from the cold, but its heartbeat was steady. It was safe. Frank had made sure of that. Somewhere far from them, Frank was drifting. The storm drain's current had dragged him through the underground tunnels of the city, slamming him against cold, slick walls, twisting him through the maze of water and debris. The last thing he remembered was fighting to breathe, his muscles screaming in exhaustion. Then, nothing. Darkness, silence, then air. Frank coughed violently as his body lurched back into consciousness. His chest burned, his limbs felt like lead, but he was alive. Barely. He blinked against the dim lighting, trying to make sense of his surroundings. He wasn't in the drain anymore. The smell of damp concrete and city waste was gone, replaced by the faint scent of disinfectant and old fabric. He was lying on a thin cot, a rough wool blanket thrown over him. His clothes were still damp, but he wasn't cold anymore. Where the hell am I? A door creaked open and footsteps approached. A tall man in his early 40s entered, his posture upright but not intimidating. His deep brown skin was weathered from years of labor, and his short black hair was peppered with gray. His face bore the kind of quiet strength that came from experience rather than force, and there was a kindness in his eyes that softened his otherwise serious demeanor. "Good, you're awake," the man said, his voice smooth but firm. "Took you a while." Frank cleared his throat, his voice raspy. "Where?" "The Hope Haven shelter," the man answered, pulling up a chair beside the cot. "You got lucky, real lucky. Current spat you out near the river. I was doing my rounds when I saw something floating near the dock. Turns out, it was you." Frank blinked sluggishly, his mind still piecing together what had happened. "You pulled me out?" The man nodded. "Yeah, you weren't breathing at first. Took a minute to get you back. Thought I'd lost you there." Frank let out a rough breath, still trying to steady himself. His ribs ached. His head felt like it had been smashed against a brick wall. But something else gnawed at him, something more urgent than his own survival. "The puppy!" he rasped, his throat raw. "The little dog! Did he make it?" The man's brows lifted slightly in surprise, but then he exhaled, a small smile forming at the corner of his lips. "That's the first thing you're asking?" Frank pushed himself up on one elbow, despite the protest from his aching body. "Did he make it?" The man studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Yeah, he made it. A kid and a woman got him out. The kid was screaming your name when I got there." Frank exhaled in relief, his body sinking back into the cot. He closed his eyes for a brief second, letting the tension in his chest ease. The puppy was safe. That was all that mattered. The man leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You must care about that dog an awful lot." Frank opened his eyes and met his gaze. "Wasn't about me," he said simply. "That little thing had no one." The man studied him again before nodding, as if he understood something unspoken. "Name's James," he finally said, extending a hand. "I run the shelter." Frank stared at the hand for a moment before grasping it. His grip was weak, but James shook it like he was shaking a brother's. There was no pity in the gesture, just recognition. James had been running Hope Haven Shelter for over 15 years. He had seen all kinds of people walk through his doors. Veterans, single mothers, teenagers who had run away from homes that were never safe. He had seen men like Frank before, weathered, tired, carrying wounds that ran deeper than the eye could see. Some found their way back. Some didn't. Frank wasn't sure which category he fell into yet. "You should rest," James said, standing up. "You took a beating in that storm. We'll talk more when you're stronger." Frank nodded slightly, but as James turned toward the door, a thought nagged at him. "James." James glanced back. "The boy," Frank asked, his voice quieter now. "Ethan, does he have anyone?" James hesitated. "Not that I know of. He disappeared before I got to the scene, but from what I heard, kid's been on the streets for a while." Frank's jaw tightened. He had seen it before. Kids slipping through the cracks, forced to grow up too fast. He knew what happened to them if no one reached out. And Ethan was a good kid. He had stayed. He had cared. Frank wasn't sure what he could do about it. Not yet. But as exhaustion finally pulled him into sleep, one thought stayed with him. If that kid was out there alone, someone had to make sure he wasn't forgotten. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the small cafe as Margaret wiped down the counter, glancing toward the cozy corner near the window. The tiny puppy, now clean and wrapped in a soft towel, lay curled in a wicker basket, its caramel-colored fur no longer matted with grime. The little thing had slept most of the night, exhausted from the ordeal, but every so often it would let out a tiny whimper, as if calling for something, or someone it had lost. Margaret sighed, tucking a stray silver-streaked curl behind her ear. The puppy needed a name, something strong, something that carried the weight of survival. "Lucky," she murmured, running a gentle hand over the pup's damp fur. "That's what you are. Lucky to be here." The door to the cafe chimed as it swung open, sending a gust of cold air through the warm interior. Ethan rushed inside, his dark brown hair still wet from the drizzle outside, his oversized jacket barely doing its job against the Chicago wind. His wide eyes immediately landed on the small bundle in the basket. "He's okay?" Ethan asked breathlessly, dropping his backpack near the door and hurrying over. He knelt beside the basket, his hands hovering over Lucky as if afraid to touch him. Margaret gave him a reassuring smile. "He's okay, kid. He just needs rest." Ethan exhaled in relief, finally reaching out to stroke the puppy's tiny head. Lucky stirred at the touch, his nose twitching as he nuzzled into the warmth of Ethan's palm. The boy chuckled softly, though his expression quickly darkened. "Frank should be here," he muttered. "He saved him. He should be here." Margaret's face softened. She had spent most of the night making calls, trying to find out what had happened after Frank was swept away. The only answer she had gotten was that emergency services had pulled a man from the river near Hope Haven Shelter. "I might have some news about him," she said carefully. "A shelter took someone in last night. I don't know for sure if it's him, but—" Ethan was already on his feet. "Where?" Margaret barely had time to grab her coat before Ethan was pulling her toward the door. Hope Haven Shelter wasn't far, But to Ethan, the walk felt endless. His legs burned from the urgency in his steps, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had spent most of his life learning not to get attached to people, because in the end, they always left. His mother had left. The foster homes had never lasted. But Frank had been different. James, the shelter manager, was just finishing a conversation with one of the volunteers when Ethan and Margaret burst through the doors. The tall, broad-shouldered man turned toward them, his sharp eyes quickly assessing the situation. "You must be looking for Frank," James said before they even spoke. Ethan's stomach twisted. "He's here?" James nodded and gestured down the hall. "He's resting, but you can see him." Ethan barely waited for permission before hurrying past. He reached a small dormitory space lined with cots and stopped when he saw Frank sitting up on one of them, a wool blanket draped over his shoulders. His face was bruised, his beard damp, but he was alive. "Frank!" Ethan's voice cracked as he ran forward. Frank barely had time to react before Ethan threw his arms around him. The boy held on tight, his small fingers gripping Frank's coat, as if letting go would mean losing him again. Frank, caught off guard, hesitated for only a second before resting a rough, calloused hand on the boy's back. "Hey, kid," he murmured, his voice hoarse but warm. "You're squishing my ribs." Ethan pulled back just enough to look at him, his eyes searching. I thought you were gone." Frank gave a tired smile. "Takes more than a storm drain to get rid of me." Margaret watched from the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, a small smirk playing on her lips. "Glad to see you in one piece," she said. "You scared the hell out of us." Frank chuckled, though it quickly turned into a cough. "Yeah, well, wasn't my best idea." Ethan sat down beside him, his knee bouncing with nervous energy. "Lucky's okay. Margaret took him in. We named him Lucky." Frank's face softened. "That's a good name." James, who had been leaning against the doorframe, finally stepped into the room. "You got people looking out for you, Frank," he said. "Not a lot of folks can say that." Frank looked at them. Ethan, the kid who had risked everything to save a dog. Margaret, the cafe owner who had cared enough to search for him. James, the man who had pulled him from the river without a second thought. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. James pulled up a chair and sat down. "You know," he said casually, "I've seen a lot of guys come through here. Most of them, they don't talk much about their past. You don't have to either. But something tells me this isn't the first time you've run toward danger instead of away from it." Frank sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. The room was silent, expectant. After a long pause, he spoke. "I used to be a firefighter." Ethan's head snapped up. "What?" Frank leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling as if he could see memories playing like a film reel. 15 years on the job, running into burning buildings, pulling people out. "It's what I did, what I was good at." His voice tightened. "Until I couldn't save the ones that mattered most." Margaret's breath hitched slightly. She had seen loss before. She knew that kind of pain. Frank continued, his tone quieter now. "There was a fire. My wife and daughter were inside. I was on call, but by the time I got there," he swallowed hard, "I didn't get to them in time." Ethan's throat went dry. He had lost people too, but never like that. Never with the weight of responsibility pressing down like a crushing force. Frank exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "After that, I didn't see the point in sticking around. The job, the house, everything. It didn't matter anymore. I walked away from it all, ended up on the streets. Been there ever since." The room was heavy with silence. Then, Ethan spoke, his voice small but firm. "You saved someone again." Frank looked at him confused. Ethan straightened his shoulders. "Lucky, you saved him, and you saved me too." Frank held his gaze. Something inside him shifted, something he hadn't felt in years. James clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Sounds to me like you've got more saving left to do." Frank didn't respond right away, but for the first time in a long time, he thought that maybe, just maybe, they were right. The early morning light streamed through the cafe windows, casting a golden glow over the small space. The scent of fresh coffee and warm pastries filled the air, mingling with the quiet hum of conversation from the few customers who had braved the chilly morning to stop by. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron, her sharp eyes scanning the shop. Frank sat at a corner table, nursing a cup of black coffee, his fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic. He looked better than he had a few days ago, less like a man weighed down by ghosts, though the weariness in his blue-gray eyes still lingered. He was clean-shaven now, his salt and pepper hair combed back, and his clothes, though simple, were neat. It was a far cry from the soaked, battered figure that had been pulled from the storm drain. Margaret walked over, placing a plate of toast in front of him. "You need to eat," she said, crossing her arms. "Can't run on just coffee." Frank smirked, picking up a slice. "Didn't know I was running." Margaret rolled her eyes. "You will be, if you take my offer." Frank looked up. "You serious about that?" She leaned against the table. "Damn right I am." Margaret wasn't the type to offer handouts. She had built this cafe from the ground up, pouring every ounce of effort into making it more than just a business. It was a place for people who needed warmth, a place where regulars felt like family, and somewhere in the last few days, Frank had become one of those people. "I could use an extra pair of hands around here," she continued. "Someone to help with deliveries, keep an eye on things. It's not much, but it's steady work. And you'd have a reason to be somewhere every morning." Frank hesitated, his fingers tapping against the mug. It had been years since he'd had any kind of stability. The thought of a routine, of responsibility, felt foreign. But when he looked at Margaret, he saw that she wasn't offering out of pity. She was offering because she believed in him. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'll take the job." Margaret smirked. "Good. You start tomorrow." Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "Not even a training period?" "Sink or swim, buddy," she said, patting his shoulder before heading back to the counter. Frank watched her go, a quiet sense of gratitude settling over him. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something real. Ethan sat at the kitchen table later that evening, bouncing his knee as he watched his foster mother, Sarah, prepare dinner. Sarah was in her early 40s, a woman with soft features and tired eyes that held a quiet strength. She had never been able to have children of her own, which was why she had opened her home to foster kids. But money was tight, and taking in another mouth to feed, especially a puppy, wasn't a simple decision. Ethan had already pleaded his case. Now he was waiting for the verdict. Sarah sighed, glancing at the tiny puppy curled up in Ethan's lap. Lucky had grown stronger over the past few days, his fur fluffier, his eyes brighter. He nuzzled into Ethan's hoodie, tiny paws tucked against his chest. "You know we don't have much," Sarah said gently. "I know," Ethan said quickly. "I'll help. I'll take care of him. He won't be a burden, I promise." Sarah exhaled, leaning against the counter. She had seen the way Ethan looked at that dog, how protective he was, and she knew what it was like to want something to hold on to, something constant. After a long pause, she finally nodded. "All right, he stays." Ethan's eyes widened. "Really?" Sarah smiled softly. "Really, but you're responsible for him." Ethan beamed, hugging Lucky close. The little puppy wagged his tail, licking Ethan's chin as if he understood what had just happened. Frank, who had been sitting quietly at the table, watching the exchange, felt something shift in his chest. Lucky had found a home, and for the first time in a long time, Frank felt like maybe he had too. The winter winds of Chicago gradually softened, giving way to the crisp air of early spring. The city still bustled with its usual indifference, pedestrians rushing past each other, cars honking in frustration. But inside Margaret's cafe, there was warmth. Not just from the scent of freshly brewed coffee or the golden light that pooled onto the wooden floors, but from the people. Frank had never imagined himself working in a cafe, yet now he was a part of its daily rhythm. His rough hands, once accustomed to gripping fire hoses and digging through debris, now carried trays of coffee, fixed leaky pipes in the back, and sometimes, even though he'd never admit it, helped Margaret with the occasional pie recipe. He had become a presence that people noticed. The customers who had once barely glanced his way now greeted him by name. The regulars appreciated the way he checked in on them, his quiet nods of understanding when they needed a moment of silence with their coffee. The homeless who wandered near the cafe found that Margaret and Frank never turned them away, always finding an extra muffin or a warm drink to offer. And then there was Lucky. The small caramel-colored puppy had grown into a playful, energetic dog with a tail that wagged like it was powered by pure joy. He had become the cafe's unofficial mascot, dashing between tables, greeting customers with enthusiastic licks, and curling up near the counter where Margaret kept a small basket just for him. For Ethan, Lucky had become his closest companion. Every day after school, he would rush to the cafe, his backpack barely making it to the coat rack, before Lucky tackled him with excitement. The boy, once used to loneliness, now had a friend who never failed to make him laugh. One evening, as the sun cast long golden shadows across the cafe, Ethan sat outside on the front steps, tossing a small rubber ball for Lucky to chase. Frank wiped his hands on a rag as he leaned against the doorframe, watching the two with a quiet sense of contentment. "Not bad for a stray," Frank remarked, nodding at Lucky, who had just skidded to a stop, his tail wagging furiously. Ethan grinned. "Not bad for either of us." Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "You're getting smart, kid. I had a good teacher." Before Frank could respond, the cafe door swung open, and a boy no older than 10 stepped hesitantly onto the sidewalk. He had light brown hair that fell into his wide blue eyes, his hands clutching the straps of his too big backpack. His clothes were clean but worn, the edges of his sleeves fraying. Ethan turned, curious. "Hey, you okay?" The boy's gaze locked onto Lucky, and before anyone could say another word, he dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around the dog. Lucky, as if sensing something unspoken, licked his face and whined, nuzzling into the boy's shoulder. Margaret, who had been clearing a nearby table, stepped outside, concern flashing in her eyes. "Sweetheart, are you lost?" The boy shook his head, burying his face into Lucky's fur for a moment, before finally whispering, "I know this dog." Ethan blinked. "You know Lucky?" The boy looked up, his eyes filled with something raw and unguarded. "I used to be alone too. I used to sit by the alley near my old apartment, and sometimes this dog would come by. He would sit with me. He made me feel less invisible." Frank frowned, exchanging a glance with Margaret. The boy hesitated before adding, "I wanted to say thank you." Ethan swallowed, his fingers tightening around Lucky's collar. "He saved you, didn't he?" The boy nodded, wiping at his eyes quickly, as if embarrassed to show emotion. Margaret stepped forward, kneeling beside him. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Oliver," he mumbled. She smiled. "Well, Oliver, do you have a place to go?" Oliver hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, my foster family's just down the street. I saw him in the window, and I had to come." Ethan looked down at Lucky, running a hand over his soft fur. "He does that," he murmured. Frank folded his arms, studying the boy for a moment. He recognized that look, the same one Ethan had the day they met. A mixture of uncertainty and quiet hope, the desperate need to believe that kindness was real. "You can visit him any time, kid," Frank said gruffly. "Lucky belongs to all of us now." Oliver's face broke into a small, shy smile. "Thanks." As the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline, Margaret ushered Oliver inside for a cup of cocoa while he waited for his foster family. Ethan sat beside Lucky on the cafe steps, watching as the lights inside flickered on, casting a warm glow against the encroaching dusk. Frank stood nearby, hands in his pockets, taking it all in. This place, these people, they had become something he never expected. A home, a second chance. And it had all started with a tiny crying puppy in the rain.